People always look at Mara Mercer and only see what's wrong. They see the scar. They see the limp. They see the body that doesn't fit into beautiful dresses. But the man who just rode into Ash Hollow, dusty, silent, eyes as sharp as knives, saw something different, and when he chose to sit down beside her instead of her beautiful sister, the whole town held its breath. No one understood why. No one believed it would last. And no one, not even Mara herself, knew that choice would change everything forever. If you want to know what happens when the world writes your name in the wrong ink, hit like, comment the city you're watching so I know how far this story has come, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part. The writer came in from the north just past midday, when the sun sat fat and merciless over the flat-baked earth of Ash Hollow, and even the dogs had enough sense to lie still in the shade. He rode a dark brown quarter horse, nothing flashy, nothing pretty, and he rode it the way a man rides when he's been in the saddle long enough that the horse and his body have settled into the same tired rhythm. No hurry to him, no performance. Gideon Blackwell was 31 years old, though he looked older in certain lights, and he carried himself with the particular quietness of a man who had learned early that talking too much rarely improved a situation. He had a face that had been broken in at least 2 places and healed crooked both times, dark stubble going to beard along a jaw that was set a little too hard for a man who claimed to be just passing through. His coat was trail-worn canvas, his boots were cracked at the heel, and the only thing about him that didn't look like it had seen better days was the rifle slung clean and careful across the back of his saddle. He stopped at the edge of the main road and looked at the town the way a man looks at a hand of cards before he decides whether to play it. Ash Hollow was not much. A feed store. A livery. A saloon with a broken shutter on the left window that nobody had bothered to fix. Maybe 40 families scattered across the valley and the surrounding parcels of land, most of them ranching, a few of them just surviving and calling it ranching to keep their pride intact. The valley itself was something: good grass, long sightlines, mountains sitting blue and serious in the distance. But the town wore its hardship plainly, the way frontier towns always did. Gideon clicked his tongue and the horse walked on. He was 3 days out from a claim near Laramie that had turned out to be everything the seller promised and nothing he'd hoped for. Thin soil over rock shelf, a creek that ran dry by August, neighbors who borrowed and didn't return. He'd sold it at a loss, settled what he owed, and pointed himself west with enough money to last a season if he was careful and a specific intention. Find land worth working, find work worth doing, and this time stay long enough to see something through. The livery owner, a heavy-set man named Cord Pruitt, took his horse without much ceremony and told him without being asked that the Mercer Ranch out on the east edge of the valley had put out word they were looking for a hand. Good enough outfit, Pruitt said, struggling some. Old man Mercer had died the previous spring and left 2 daughters and more debt than the property was worth on paper, but the land itself was solid. The younger one's a real picture, Pruitt added, with the tone of a man sharing information he considered valuable. Vivian. Looks like she stepped off a catalog page. Half the unmarried men in the county have tried their luck already. Gideon absorbed this without comment. He asked for directions. The Mercer Ranch sat on a low rise east of town with the mountains behind it and a view of the whole valley spread out to the west. It had been a good operation once. You could see it in the bones of the place. The main barn was solid timber, well joined with quality ironwork on the doors. The house was larger than most in the area. 2 stories, a wide front porch, the kind of structure a man built when he believed he was starting something that would outlast him. But neglect had set in. The south fence line was down in 3 places Gideon could count from the road. The water trough near the gate had a split seam, and the ground around it was permanently soft and wasted. 2 horses in the near pasture were carrying more weight than they should have been for late summer, which meant the grazing rotation was off. He was still looking when the front door opened. The woman who came out onto the porch moved with a hitch in her left leg, swinging that hip slightly forward to compensate, and she came down the porch steps with the careful deliberateness of someone who has made peace with the fact that certain movements require concentration. She was not small, broad through the shoulders and solid through the body in a way that spoke of physical labor sustained over years. And she wore work clothes, dungarees, and a faded shirt with the sleeves rolled past the elbow, her dark hair pulled back in a knot that had started coming loose somewhere around noon. The left side of her face carried a scar. It ran from just below her cheekbone to the edge of her jaw in a pale, uneven line, old enough to have settled into the skin, not raw, not new, but permanent. She didn't turn away from him or try to angle her face. She just looked at him the way she would look at any rider who pulled up to her gate. "You looking for work or lost?" she said. "Work," Gideon said. "Cord Pruitt mentioned you might be hiring." She looked at him for a moment. "Step down, then." He dismounted and tied the horse to the post, and she came to the fence rather than asking him to come to the house. That struck him. She wanted to look at him before she invited him any further, which was either smart caution or a habit from being left to manage things herself, probably both. "Mara Mercer," she said. She didn't offer her hand, but her eyes were straight on him, dark brown and sharp. "Gideon Blackwell." "Where from?" "Most recently, Laramie. Before that, a few places." "What kind of places?" "Cattle operations mostly. Some horse work. Did a season with a survey crew, which wasn't ranching, but it taught me country." She glanced past him at the horse, then at the rifle, then back at his face. "Any reason a man from mostly Laramie can't stay put?" "Land didn't work out." "Yours or someone else's?" "Mine. Bought it on bad information." She studied him. "At least you're honest about it." She leaned against the fence post and crossed her arms. "I can offer room, board, and fair wages. Fair meaning I'll tell you what I can pay, and you can tell me if it suits, and we won't pretend the number's bigger than it is." "I appreciate that," he said. "Work's not light. We're behind on about 6 different things, and I'm short-handed, so you'd be pulling longer days than the wage probably warrants while we catch up. I'll tell you that up front, too. I've pulled long days before. Most men say that before they've done it here." She said it without particular bitterness, just matter of fact. "This valley's harder than it looks." "So am I," he said. Something shifted in her face, not a smile exactly, more like she was filing something away. "Come on in then, I'll show you the property." Meta. Vivian Mercer appeared at the doorway as they were coming up from the barn, and the effect was something Gideon noticed the way you notice a change in weather. You can't not notice it, but what you do about it is a different matter. She was striking, genuinely so, with light brown hair and a way of standing in a doorway that suggested she had practiced and found the angle that served her best. She wore a dress that was cleaner and better fitted than anything a working ranch called for. "I didn't hear a rider come in," she said, and her eyes went to Gideon, and then stayed there with the specific attention of someone who has just decided something. "This is Gideon Blackwell," Mara said. "He's looking at the foreman position." "Foreman," Vivian said, as if tasting the word. She came down the porch steps, nothing careful about her movement, nothing compensated, just the natural ease of a body that had never been asked to endure much, and she extended her hand. "Vivian Mercer, welcome to our ranch." "Thank you," Gideon said. He shook her hand and then returned his attention to Mara. "You said the south line was the biggest gap?" Vivian blinked. Mara glanced between them, and something in her settled, very slightly, the way a person settles when they realize they are not about to be pushed aside in their own yard. "South line and the water situation at the East Trough. I'll show you." He was hired by sundown. The first thing Gideon did the following morning, before breakfast, before the hands arrived, before the day had properly started, was walk the south fence line on foot. All of it. 3 miles in the early cool, with the grass wet against his boots and the sun barely up, stopping to test posts, check wire tension, note what needed replacing versus what could be repaired. Mara found him at the far corner when she brought out coffee in a tin cup, making her way across the uneven ground with that rolling, careful stride, and she didn't say anything about the early start or pretend to be surprised by it. She just handed him the cup and stood beside him, looking at the same post he was looking at. "Frost heave," she said. "It's been doing that since the winter before last. I keep meaning to dig it out and reset it." "I'll do it today," he said. "I figured." She sipped from her own cup. "The crew I've got, Dale and 2 cousins of his, they're not lazy exactly. They just follow the work they're given. Nobody's been telling them what to look for. What happened to your regular foreman? Her jaw shifted. Left in March. Said the ranch wasn't worth the risk anymore. She paused. He wasn't wrong about the risk. He was just wrong about the worth. Gideon drank his coffee and looked at the mountains. Tell me about the east pasture, he said. The grass looked thin. She told him. She told him about the grazing rotation her father had used, which had worked for 20 years, and how the drought the previous summer had broken that rotation and they hadn't corrected it yet. She knew the land. That much was obvious immediately. She talked about this ground the way people talk about something they've studied and lived inside of, not the way they repeat information they were given. When he asked about soil quality along the creek bend, she knew it. When he asked about the old irrigation channel he'd seen half buried on the north side, she knew the history of that too. Your father teach you all this? He asked. My father taught Vivian how to keep the accounts, she said. It was not a complaint, just a fact, stated flat. By the end of the first week, Gideon had developed a working theory about the Mercer Ranch, which was this. The land itself was not the problem. The land had problems, but land problems are workable. The real issue was that the person who understood the land best was not the person anyone had ever thought to ask. He found Mara useful in a way that was hard to explain to the other hands, because it wasn't the obvious kind of useful. She wasn't faster than anyone or stronger than anyone, not with the leg the way it was. But she knew where the soft ground was that would bog a wagon in wet weather, and she knew which trees on the East Ridge were old enough to have deep roots you could anchor a fence to, and she knew that the creek bend near the lower pasture flooded in late May every year without fail, and you had to move the calves out by the 15th, or you'd lose some. He started asking her things directly, which seemed to confuse her at first. Why are you asking me? She said one afternoon, when he came to find her in the barn while she was running a comb through a mare's mane. Dale's been here 3 seasons. Dale doesn't know why the North Trough fills slower than the South one, Gideon said. I asked him. He said it's just always been that way. She looked at him. It's because the feed pipe on the north line runs across the slope instead of down it. My father angled it wrong when he laid it, and the water's working uphill at the end. Costs you about 1/3 of the flow. Gideon stared at her. Can it be fixed? Redigging the line would take a week, or you could add a second intake at the slope break and let gravity do the work from there. Cheaper, half a day. Why hasn't anyone done it? She went back to the mare. Nobody asked me. Vivian had, by this point, made several attempts to redirect Gideon's attention toward herself, and each one had been politely but unmistakably sidestepped. The first was a question about whether he needed help settling into the foreman's quarters, which she offered with the particular warmth of someone who doesn't actually mean the helping, just the conversation that comes with it. He thanked her and said he'd managed fine. The second was an invitation to dinner at the house, which was reasonable enough and which he accepted, only to spend most of the meal talking to Mara about whether it was worth trying to run a second hay cut before the weather turned. The third was more direct. Vivian found him at the corral fence one evening and leaned beside him and said without preamble, Do you plan on staying here long? Depends on the work, he said. It seems like you and Mara get along well. She said it with the particular inflection of someone who has decided that what they've observed is strange and wants to see if you'll explain it to them. She knows this ranch, he said. That's useful. She knows it from the inside, Vivian said. But she's never been good with people. You need someone who can handle the business side, the town relationships, the negotiations. I'm not interested in negotiations right now, he said. I'm interested in getting the South herd's grazing rotation corrected before the grass dies out. Vivian looked at him for a long moment. He could see her recalibrating, deciding how to play it different, and he recognized that process in her because he'd seen it before in people who were used to charm working on everyone. You're not like most men who come through here, she finally said. I'm not trying to be otherwise, he said, and pushed off the fence and went back to work. The spring was Mara's discovery. She told him about it on a Thursday evening when they were both tired, sitting on the water barrel outside the barn after a long day fixing the irrigation problem she'd described, dirt on both of them and the sun going orange across the valley. There's water on this property that nobody's properly mapped, she said. He looked at her. Below the East Ridge. There's a spring, deep one. I found it when I was about 15, following a fault line in the rock after a wet winter. It feeds into the aquifer that runs under the whole lower valley. Gideon was quiet for a moment. How much water? Reliable through drought years. I know because I watched it. She looked down at her hands. If it's what I think it is, it's not just this ranch. It's the water source for everything east of the creek, every operation in that section. He sat with that. Your father know? He knew there was a spring. He didn't know the scale of it. She paused. I didn't tell him everything I knew, because I was 17 and thought maybe I was wrong. Then he got sick, and there was never a good time, and then he was gone. You need to map it, Gideon said. I know. If Silas Crow finds out before you've documented it, I know, she said again, and her voice was flat in a way that told him she'd been thinking about exactly that for longer than he'd been on the property. Silas Crow owned the next 3 parcels to the north and had been making quiet offers on the Mercer land since before the old man died. The offers were always slightly below reasonable, always delivered through intermediaries, always with the unspoken suggestion that the Mercer women were in over their heads and would be better off selling and moving somewhere manageable. We survey it ourselves, Gideon said, before anyone else knows what we're looking at. Mara nodded slowly, and then, as if the decision had settled something that had been unsettled for a long time, she let out a breath and leaned back against the barn wall and looked at the sky. I've been carrying this ranch by myself for a year, she said. Not complaining, just stating. I know, he said. I'm tired. I know that too. I'm not asking for rescue, she said. And she looked at him directly when she said it, and her eyes were serious and a little hard, the way eyes get when the person behind them has learned that help comes with conditions and is deciding whether this time might be different. Good, he said. I'm not offering one. I'm offering a partnership, if you want it. She looked at him for a long time. Let's go look at that spring, she said. We'll try. They walked out to the East Ridge in the last of the evening light, moving slowly to accommodate the ground and the leg and the fading visibility, neither of them in any particular hurry. And when they reached the outcrop Mara had been thinking about for 15 years, Gideon crouched down and put his hand against the rock and felt the cold seeping through it. Mara stood above him on the slope, balanced easy despite the leg, and watched him. There, she said, pointing to where the rock face split in a long lateral crack. He looked, and then he looked up at her. Yeah, he said. The valley spread out below them, the last light catching the grass and the distant silver line of the creek, and somewhere to the north, past 3 property lines, the lights of Silas Crow's main house would be coming on about now. We're going to need to move fast, Gideon said. I've been moving slow my whole life, Mara said. I'm ready to try something different. She said it without drama, without any performance of resolve, just plainly, the way she said most things. And Gideon, who had met a great many people in 31 years and could usually tell within the first few days whether someone would hold or fold when things turned hard, looked at this woman on the ridge with the scar and the limp and the 15 years of carrying this land on her back and thought, this one holds. He didn't say it out loud. He just turned back to the rock and began to plan. They surveyed the spring over 2 days, working early mornings before the hands arrived, mapping the rock face with a length of rope and a compass Gideon carried in his coat pocket. Mara moved across that terrain better than he expected. She knew where to put her feet, had learned the ground here the way a person learns a room they've crossed in the dark 1,000 times. And she directed him along the fault line with a confidence that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with having paid attention for 15 years while everyone else looked the other direction. What they found was larger than either of them had said out loud that first evening. The spring didn't just feed the lower pasture. Following the fault southeast, they found 3 separate seep points where the water was pushing through the rock, and below the main outcrop, in a sheltered hollow choked with brush that nobody had apparently walked through in years, the ground was soft and dark and permanently wet. Even in this dry stretch of late summer, Gideon cut into the earth with his boot heel and hit water at 8 inches. This is the source, Mara said. She was crouched beside him, her bad leg extended, both hands pressed flat against the wet ground. Everything downstream runs off this. The creek on Crow's north parcel. His stock pond too, if I'm right about the gradient. She looked up. Which I am. He believed her. We need it documented, written, dated, witnessed. Who do we get to witness it? Not someone from town. Town talks. He thought for a moment. There's a land surveyor out of Cheyenne, name of Aldrich, reputable. He comes through this territory in the fall circuit. That's 6 weeks. Then we don't tell anyone what we've found until he gets here, Gideon said. Not Dale, not the cousins. Nobody. Mara stood, brushing her palms against her dungarees. Not Vivian. It wasn't a question exactly, more like a line being drawn. Not Vivian, he agreed. She nodded and looked at the wet ground one more time, something in her face that was neither happiness nor relief, but something closer to the feeling of finally being right about something. You'd kept quiet for so long that you'd started to wonder if you'd imagined it. All right, she said. Let's go fix that feed pipe before Dale notices we've been gone. Whoa. The work in the weeks that followed was unglamorous and relentless, and Gideon found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he didn't mind it. There was a logic to the Mercer Ranch that revealed itself gradually, the way a landscape reveals itself on a long ride, each new mile showing you something the last mile had been hiding. Mara had built systems here, improvised ones, workarounds for problems that hadn't been properly solved but had been managed well enough to keep the operation limping forward. Some of those workarounds were genuinely clever. Some of them were the kind of clever that comes from desperation and shouldn't be mistaken for sound practice. He started learning to tell the difference. They reset the south fence posts, all of them, not just the ones that had already failed. Because Mara pointed out that the ones still standing were only standing because the frost hadn't hit them twice yet, and it would. He reran the North Trough feed line the way she'd described, cutting into the slope at the breakpoint and letting the grade do the work, and the trough filled in half the time it had before. He adjusted the grazing rotation, moving the south herd to the creek pasture in a sequence Mara mapped out on the back of a flour sack with a piece of charcoal. None of it was fast. All of it was necessary. What changed, slowly and without either of them commenting on it directly, was the way they worked together. In the first week, Gideon had been asking questions, and Mara had been answering them with the careful reserve of someone who had learned that offering opinions led to being ignored or overruled. By the third week, she had stopped waiting to be asked. She'd come to him in the morning with a list of what she'd seen the day before and what she thought should be done about it, delivered in that flat, practical voice of hers, and he would listen, and then they would decide together what to tackle first. He noticed, and he thought she noticed that he noticed, but neither of them made it into a thing. The hands noticed too. Dale Pruitt, no relation to the livery man, was a lean, weathered ranch hand in his 40s who had been on the Mercer property 3 seasons and had long operated under the assumption that the woman in the house who walked with a limp was someone you were polite to and then worked around. He wasn't cruel about it. He just hadn't seen any evidence that her opinion was worth routing his day around. That changed when Gideon started deferring to her publicly. Not dramatically, just the ordinary, unremarkable way of it. Dale would ask how they wanted the hay stacked in the new loft configuration, and Gideon would say, "Mara, what do you think about the weight distribution on the east wall?" And Mara would say something specific and correct, and Gideon would say, "That's how we'll do it then," and move on. After the third or fourth time, Dale started asking her directly. She didn't comment on that either, but once, when Gideon was at the water trough and happened to look back toward the barn, he saw her standing in the doorway watching Dale's retreating back with an expression that was carefully neutral except in the eyes, where something old and tired had loosened just slightly. Vivian, meanwhile, was struggling with a situation she hadn't anticipated and didn't have a ready strategy for, which was the experience of being consistently, politely irrelevant to the person she had decided she wanted. She was not accustomed to this. In Ash Hollow and the surrounding territory, Vivian Mercer's looks had served as a kind of currency that she had been spending since she was 16, and while she was not foolish about it, she understood that currency devalues over time and had given thought to what she would do when that happened. She had not expected to find herself in a situation where the currency simply didn't apply. Gideon was not rude to her. That would have been easier to work with. He was courteous, direct, and genuinely uninterested in the specific way of a man whose attention is fully committed elsewhere. Not to another woman, not to a scheme, but to a piece of work he's decided matters to him. It left Vivian with nothing to push against. She started watching him with Mara. This was not comfortable watching. Not because of anything dramatic. They were not what anyone could point to and call anything. They were just two people doing ranch work together. But because of the quality of attention Gideon gave her sister, the way he stopped what he was doing when Mara was talking, the way he positioned himself slightly downslope on uneven terrain without appearing to think about it so that the grade was easier under her bad leg. Small things, the kind of things a person did when they had taken the time to notice how another person moved through the world. Vivian sat with this for about a week and then took it to their cousin Hattie, who came to town every other Saturday for supplies. "He's not right in the head," Hattie said, helpfully. "He's perfectly sensible," Vivian said, which was the problem. "Men like a project," Hattie said. "Maybe once the ranch is fixed up, he'll look around and see what's in front of him." Vivian thought about this. She didn't think it was wrong, exactly, but she also thought that Gideon Blackwell was the kind of man who didn't operate that way, who didn't pivot based on what was convenient or available, and that particular quality, the thing that made him unattainable to her, was probably the same thing that made him worth wanting. She went home from that conversation in a mood that she identified as jealousy and found that identifying it didn't make it any smaller. Das. The first word they got about Silas Crow came from an unexpected direction. Hob Finley ran a small sheep operation on the west side of the valley and had absolutely no love for Crow, who had pressured him twice to sell his water rights and twice been refused. He came to the Mercer Ranch on a Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has decided that information is worth more than pride. "He's been talking to Dawes at the land office," Hob said. They were standing in the yard, the three of them, Hob, Gideon, and Mara, who had come out of the barn when she heard the wagon. Asking about the Mercer property boundaries, specifically the East Ridge line. Mara's face didn't change. Gideon glanced at her. "What kind of questions?" Gideon asked. "Water rights questions?" Hob turned his hat brim through his fingers. "Dawes isn't a bad man. He's just not going to turn down a powerful neighbor's curiosity. He told Crow the boundary surveys on this parcel are 20 years old, which they are. Which means they predate the spring documentation," Gideon said, carefully. "Which means," Mara said, "that if Crow moves to claim the East Ridge water before we've got current survey documentation, he might have a legal argument." "Might," Hob said. "Might" is doing a lot of work in that sentence, but yet. There was a short silence. "Aldrich gets here in 4 weeks, Gideon said. 4 weeks might be 3 weeks too many, Mara said. Hob left them the information and his good wishes and drove his wagon back out the gate, and Mara and Gideon stood in the yard for a moment without talking. A fly was working the water trough. One of the horses in the near pasture sneezed. "I can write to Aldrich," Gideon said. "Ask him to move up the date. He might not come. Then I ride to Cheyenne myself." She looked at him. "That's 4 days there and back." "I know." "The ranch? You ran it before I got here," he said. "You can run it for 4 days." She bristled slightly, and he saw it, and he understood that he'd said it wrong. Not that the words were untrue, but that they had arrived in a tone that sounded like he was dismissing her, and that was not a wound she took lightly. "That came out sideways," he said. "I meant it as a fact, not a compliment, and not a brush-off. You know this operation better than anyone." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. Then, "Write the letter first. Aldrich might be flexible." Odds. Aldrich wasn't flexible, but his assistant was, and the letter that came back 2 weeks later said that an associate surveyor named Pike could come out the following week if the client could cover travel costs, which were not insignificant, but were significantly less than losing water rights to a legal challenge from a land baron with money for attorneys. Mara paid it out of the household account without flinching and without discussing it with Vivian, which was technically within her authority as the managing partner and practically a declaration of war. Vivian found out from Dale, who mentioned it in passing while Vivian was bringing lunch out to the crew, And the expression that crossed her face was the kind that doesn't resolve into any one emotion because several of them are arriving simultaneously. She found Mara in the barn that evening. "You spent $40 without asking me," Vivian said. "I'm the managing partner," Mara said. She was checking a mare's back left shoe and didn't look up. "I don't need your approval on operational expenses." $40 is not operational expenses. $40 is what we pay to document a water source that could determine whether this ranch survives or gets absorbed into Silas Crow's holdings in the next 2 years. Mara set the mare's hoof down and turned to face her sister. "That's what it is." Vivian stared at her. "What water source?" Mara hesitated. It was a fraction of a second, but Vivian caught it. "The spring on the East Ridge," Mara said. "We need it properly surveyed and documented. We've always known about that spring. Not the full extent of it." Vivian's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mara said carefully, "that it's bigger than we thought, and if we don't document it properly, someone else might establish a claim to it." "Someone like Crow?" "Yes." A silence opened up in the barn. The mare shifted her weight. Outside, somewhere past the fence line, a nighthawk was making its hunting call in the dusk. "Why didn't you tell me?" Vivian said. "Because I didn't want it talked about until we were ready." "I'm your sister." "I know who you are," Mara said, and her voice had gone flat in a way that closed the conversation rather than opened it. "I'm handling it. That's what I do." Vivian left the barn, and Mara stood there alone with the mare and the smell of hay and her own heartbeat, and she thought about whether she'd handled that correctly and decided she probably hadn't, and also that she'd do the same thing again, and also that there was something exhausting about being the kind of person who carries everything and never quite figures out how to put any of it down. Pike arrived on a Wednesday, a younger man than Gideon had expected, meticulous and quiet, with a surveyor's instinct for looking at terrain before he said anything about it. Mara walked him out to the East Ridge herself, taking the long route around the base of the slope where the ground was firmer, and Gideon came behind with the equipment. Pike worked for 2 full days. He mapped the fault line, took depth measurements at the seep points, documented the flow rate at the main outcrop, and established the boundary coordinates from the original survey markers. When he was done, he sat at the kitchen table with his notes spread out and told them what they had. "The source is on your property," he said. "Definitively. The boundary runs here." He marked the map with a pencil. "And the mainspring head is here, 11 feet inside your east line." Mara sat across from him with her hands flat on the table. "And the water rights." "In the territory, documented water rights attach to the land parcel if the source is on the property and the owner can demonstrate prior use and knowledge." He looked at her. "Can you?" "Since I was 15, she said. "Write that down," Gideon said. She wrote it down, and Pike witnessed it, and they paid him the second half of the survey fee, and he left the next morning with copies of the documentation that he would file in Cheyenne on their behalf. When his wagon had gone far enough down the road that the dust was just a smudge on the horizon, Mara sat down on the porch steps and didn't say anything for a while. Gideon sat beside her. The valley was doing what it did in the early mornings, lying out flat and golden under a sky so wide it didn't seem real. "It's ours," he said. "It was always ours," she said. "Now it's documented." "That's the part that matters." She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "Crow's going to find out." "I know. When he does, he's not going to write a letter." "I know that too." She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the valley. His jaw was set in that particular way it had when he was thinking through a problem he hadn't solved yet, but was working on. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Yes," he said, without any particular hesitation, and she found that she trusted him more for it. "Me too," she said. They sat there a while longer, both of them tired, both of them clear-eyed about what was coming, and the morning light did what morning light does regardless of what people are sitting in it worrying about. It came up anyway, slow and indifferent and honest, laying itself across the land that was theirs, that had always been theirs, that they were finally in a position to defend. Crow didn't write a letter. What he sent instead was silence, 2 weeks of it, the particular kind that has weight to it, that you feel on the back of your neck when you're working in the yard and you look up and the road is empty, but you have the distinct sense that it wasn't empty recently. Gideon noticed it. Mara noticed it more because she had been living adjacent to Silas Crow's ambitions for longer, and she knew what his silences meant. They meant he was repositioning. They meant the next move was being planned somewhere you couldn't see it. She told Gideon this on a Friday evening while they were going over the fence repair list on the porch, and he listened without interrupting, which was one of the things about him she had come to rely on without quite meaning to. "He knows about the survey," she said. "Word gets around in a valley this small. He knows, and he's deciding what to do about it. He could challenge it legally. He could. He won't." She set the paper down. "Crow doesn't like courts. Courts leave records, and records can be read by people you didn't intend. He prefers to make problems go away in ways that don't leave paper." "What kind of ways?" She looked at him steadily. "The kind that look like accidents." Gideon absorbed this. Outside, the evening insects had started up, and somewhere across the pasture one of the horses was moving along the fence line, its hooves soft against the dry ground. "We should move the documentation copy off the property," he said. "Already did. Mailed a copy to my mother's sister in Denver 2 days ago." She paused. "And I told Dale to start sleeping in the barn." He looked at her. "He thought it was about the horses," she said. "I didn't correct him." He almost smiled. "You've been thinking about this longer than I have." "I've been thinking about Silas Crow for 2 years," she said. "I've had time to work through the options." The fire started on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Pike's wagon had disappeared down the road toward Cheyenne. It was 2 in the morning, which told you something about the people who set it, that they were careful enough to wait for the deepest part of the night, when even light sleepers are at their lowest, when the body's pull toward unconsciousness is strongest. What they hadn't counted on was Dale Pruitt, who had been sleeping in the barn for 3 weeks, and who was a poor sleeper in the best conditions, and who woke to the smell of smoke before the flames had climbed more than 6 feet up the south wall. He came out of the barn yelling, and his yelling woke the cousins in the bunkhouse, and by the time Gideon hit the yard with his boots half-laced, the fire was running up the barn's south face in a bright, hungry line, the old timber taking it the way old timber does, without hesitation. Mara was 30 seconds behind him. She came off the porch, still pulling her coat on, took one look at the barn, and said, "The horses." "Dale's getting them," Gideon said. "There are 6 in the back stalls. Dale can't—" She was already moving, that rolling hitch-and-drive gait, eating ground faster than it looked like it should, and Gideon went after her because arguing about it in front of a burning barn was not a useful expenditure of time. They got 5 horses out. The 6th, a young gelding that had always been skittish, panicked at the smoke and broke back toward the burning stall twice before Mara caught its lead and put her face against its neck and said something low and constant into its ear that Gideon couldn't hear, walking it backward out of the smoke and into the night air with a grip on that rope that her knuckles went white. Outside, the gelding shook and stamped, and Mara held on and didn't let go. The barn went. There was no saving it. They had enough people to keep the fire from jumping to the house, and that was all they had. They formed a bucket line from the water trough and held the perimeter and watched the structure come down, the roof falling inward in a cascade of sparks that rose and drifted and died in the dark air above them. By 4 in the morning, it was coals and framework. Dale sat on the ground with his head in his hands. One of the cousins had burned his forearm on a falling beam, and Mara had wrapped it with strips torn from her work shirt while he was still telling her he was fine. Gideon stood at the edge of what had been the south wall and looked at where the fire had started, in the corner by the old tax storage, and at the way the char was heaviest at the base there, in a pattern that didn't look like an accident. He didn't say anything about it in front of the crew. By mid-morning, what was left of Ash Hollow had heard about the fire, and a few of the closer neighbors came out to look and offer whatever a neighbor can offer when the damage is already done. Company, mostly, and food, because food is what people bring when they don't know what else to do. Hob Finley came with his wife and a pot of something that had beans in it. The Garrity family from the south end sent their oldest boy with 2 smoked hams. Cord Pruitt from the livery drove out himself and stood at the edge of the debris and shook his head in the specific way of a man who has seen fire take things before. "You need lumber," he said to Gideon. "I need to know who walked my property line at 2 in the morning, Gideon said. Pruitt looked at him sideways. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure about the fire pattern." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. I'm not saying I know anything. I'm saying Crow sent 2 men into town last week that nobody recognized, stayed at the saloon 2 nights and left quiet. What did they look like? Like men who are paid to not be remembered, Pruitt said, which is a kind of looking I recognize. He left the lumber offer open and drove back to town, and Gideon walked to where Mara was standing near the ruins of the south wall, looking at something specific in the debris that he couldn't identify. Cord says Crow had men in town last week, Gideon said. I know, Hattie told me yesterday. I didn't want to say anything until we had more than town talk. She crouched down slowly, bad leg extending, and picked up a piece of blackened wood from the edge of the debris. She turned it in her hands. This was pre-cut. He looked at what she was holding. The end of the timber was not jagged the way a burned piece breaks. It was clean at one end, angled, the kind of cut you make when you want a piece to sit flat against a surface and make contact along its full length. She was right. Someone had prepared the fire, not just set it. They'll come back, she said. She set the timber down. Probably. For the spring. She stood slowly, and her face was doing that thing it did when she was working through something painful and keeping it interior rather than external. If they can't buy it, and they can't challenge it in court, and they can't scare us off, they'll try to destroy it, Gideon said. Make the spring inaccessible, blow the rock face. The word landed between them. How much time do we have? She asked. I don't know. Less than we'd like. She nodded, the way she nodded when a thing was settled and she was moving on to what came next. Then we need a plan that doesn't depend on time we don't have. The cattle were what nobody had been watching while the barn burned, which was, in retrospect, exactly the point. Dale found the gap in the east fence the next morning, a clean cut in the wire that left a 15-foot opening onto the rough terrain that ran up toward the canyon head. The south herd, 62 head, had pushed through in the night, spooked by the fire's noise and light, and by the time anyone located them, they had moved east into the broken country at the base of the ridge, drifting in that aimless gathering momentum that cattle get when they're frightened and terrain is funneling them somewhere they shouldn't go. The canyon was a quarter-mile ahead of them. It was not a drop so much as a narrowing gorge with a rock floor 30 feet below and walls that a steer could get into but not out of. The kind of terrain that killed animals not all at once but one at a time over several terrible hours. Gideon went after them on horseback and understood within 10 minutes that he couldn't turn them alone. The herd was too spread in the brush, moving in a loose forward pressure rather than a single group, and every time he pushed one animal back, 2 others moved up on the side. He could see the canyon from the ridge above, the rock walls, the shadow between them, the narrow slot of an entrance that the cattle were 60 yards from enclosing. He didn't know Mara had gone for the rifle. He found out the way everyone else did, which was the sound, a single crack that came off the ridge above them and hit the air like something solid. And then, 4 seconds later, a deep grinding concussion that was not a gunshot but the response to one, the rock answering the bullet. He looked up. The overhang on the east wall of the canyon entrance, a slab of limestone the size of a barn door that had been sitting at that angle for longer than anyone alive could account for, came off the face in sections, not all at once, not in the movie clean way of things falling, but in the real way, which is irregular and loud and longer than you expect. The first piece came down and broke against the canyon floor, and the sound of that breaking bounced around the rock walls, and that sound alone turned the lead steers. The second and third pieces followed in the next 6 seconds, and by the time the dust was rising from the canyon entrance, the slot was sealed to a height of 8 feet with limestone rubble that no steer was going to climb. The herd turned, not calmly. They turned in the panicked, shoulder-bumping way of cattle that have decided somewhere in their collective instinct that the direction they were going is no longer viable. And they pushed back through the brush and away from the canyon, and Gideon, who had been holding his horse still on the ridge while his heart did something irregular in his chest, turned his horse and went to collect them. It took 2 hours to get the herd back through the gap, and he did most of it by himself, because by the time Dale and the cousins arrived, Gideon had already covered most of the ground, moving back and forth across the brush, in that patient, repetitive way that cattle work requires, not rushing it, not forcing it, just being present at the right angles until the animals ran out of other ideas. When he got back to the property and counted them through the repaired gap, all 62, He unsaddled his horse and walked to the east ridge. Mara was still up there. She was sitting on the flat rock below the main outcrop, the buffalo rifle across her knees, and she was looking at her hands, not examining them, just looking at them the way you look at something that has just done something you weren't entirely sure it could do. The rifle was an old Sharps, the kind that had been made for dropping buffalo at distances that seemed implausible until you understood the cartridge. It was her mother's, she had told him once, briefly, the kind of once that meant she wasn't going to tell him the rest of the story unless he asked directly, and maybe not even then. He sat down beside her on the rock. Neither of them said anything for a while. "Did you get them all?" she asked finally. 62, he said. She let out a breath. "I wasn't sure the overhang would go," she said. "I've been looking at that rock for years. It's been cracked through the base for at least a decade. I thought—" She stopped. "I thought if I hit the right point it might. But thinking it might and knowing it will are different things." "You hit the right point." "I got lucky," she said, and her voice was flat in the way that meant she was refusing to let herself feel the relief yet, because relief was a thing you allowed yourself after you'd checked the work, not before. "Both can be true," he said. She looked at him. Her face was smudged with dust from the ridge and her hair had come entirely out of its knot, and there was something in her expression that was raw, in the way a person gets when they've been running on hard concentration, and the task is finished and the body suddenly remembers it's tired. "People are going to say it was luck," she said. "Some people," he said. "People who weren't here." "Even people who were here." She looked back at her hands. "A woman my size, with this leg, with this face, the story people are going to tell is that she got lucky. Not that she'd been looking at that overhang for years and calculating whether it was possible, and knew the Sharps and knew the cartridge, and had decided in the first 30 seconds of hearing the cattle move that if they got within 40 yards of the canyon entrance she would do exactly what she did." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You decided all that in 30 seconds? 20, she said. 30 was when I was already climbing." He looked at her for a long time. She didn't look back at him. She kept looking at her hands, and he thought she was probably embarrassed by what she'd just said, not because it wasn't true, but because she wasn't used to saying things that were true about herself without immediately walking them back. "The people who matter were here," he said, "or they'll hear it from people who were." "Dale saw it," she said. "Dale saw it," he confirmed. A pause. Below them the valley was getting on with its afternoon, indifferent to what had just happened up on the ridge. The cattle in the east pasture moving slow and unbothered now, the creek glinting where the sun hit it. "My mother taught me to shoot that rifle," Mara said. "She was a better shot than my father, and she never let him forget it. But she only said it to him, never to anyone else, because that was how things worked." She turned the Sharps over in her hands. "She told me the rifle would be useful someday. I thought she meant for hunting." "She wasn't wrong about useful," Gideon said. Mara made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. Close enough. "Crow's going to know it was deliberate," she said. "He sent people to spook the herd toward that canyon, and it didn't work, and he's going to know it didn't work because someone stopped it." "Good," Gideon said. She looked at him. "Good," he said again. "Let him know. Let him think about what that means before he tries the next thing." She studied his face. "You want him scared." "I want him to recalculate," Gideon said. "Scared men make mistakes. Men who recalculate sometimes decide the risk isn't worth it." He paused. "But we should assume he's not going to decide that." "He's not," Mara said. "He's angry now. Angry men with money don't recalculate." "Then we'd better be ready for what comes next." She nodded and stood up from the rock, pulling herself up by leverage and balance rather than the leg. A movement she made look easier than it was, because she'd been making it look easier than it was her whole life. She settled the Sharps over her shoulder. "I need to get down before my leg stiffens," she said. "And then I need to eat something, and then I need to think." "In that order?" he said. "Probably not the thinking," she admitted. "The thinking's already happening." He stood and they went down the ridge together, Mara picking her line through the rocks with that particular careful attention, and Gideon staying to her left without making a thing of it. And below them, Ash Hollow lay in the afternoon sun, looking like the kind of place that things didn't happen to, which was the lie that small towns tell about themselves. and which the people in them sometimes believe right up until the moment they don't. The thinking Mara said was already happening didn't stop when she got off the ridge. It kept going through dinner, which she barely touched, and through the evening when she sat at the kitchen table with her mother's old survey map spread out under the lamplight and a piece of charcoal in her hand, marking things and then rubbing them out and marking them differently. Gideon left her alone with it. He had learned in the past weeks that her thinking was a thing with its own tempo, and that interrupting it to ask where she was in the process was the wrong instinct, even when it looked from the outside like she was just sitting there staring at a piece of paper. He was on the porch when she came out at 9:30. "He's going to go for the spring directly," she said. "Not another distraction. The spring itself." "Explosives," Gideon said. He had been thinking the same thing. "It's the only thing that makes sense. He can't buy it, can't claim it legally now that it's documented, can't scare us into selling. If he collapses the main outcrop, buries the source under enough rock, the documentation becomes irrelevant. A spring that doesn't flow is just a wet spot on a survey map." Gideon leaned forward on the porch rail. The night was clear and cold, stars hard and numerous above the valley. He'd need to get men up to the East Ridge with enough dynamite to do the job. That's not a quiet operation. "No," she said. "But it's a fast one. An hour of work, maybe less. By the time anyone knows what happened, it's done." "So he comes at night." "He comes at night," she agreed, "and not with 2 men this time. With enough men that if we're up there trying to stop it, the question isn't about the spring anymore." She said it plainly, the way she said most hard things, and Gideon sat with the implication of it without looking away from it. "We can't defend the ridge in the dark against numbers," he said. "No, we'd lose that fight." She sat down in the other porch chair, extending her leg the way she did when it was aching, which it was most evenings, but especially after the climbing she'd done today. "So we don't fight it that way." "What way do we fight it?" She turned the charcoal piece over in her fingers. "There's a trail on the north face of the ridge. Old goat trail. Been there longer than the ranch. My father used it twice and then forgot about it because it's not worth knowing unless you're trying to get above the canyon approach without being seen from below." Gideon looked at her. "How far above?" 40 feet of elevation over the main approach, maybe 50 in places. If you're on the trail and someone's below you on the standard ridge path, they don't know you're there unless you make noise. And the spring approach comes up the standard path. Only way to bring loaded men up without losing somebody. The goat trail is single file and the footing is bad in daylight. In the dark with equipment, you'd need to know every step." "But you know every step," Gideon said. "I know every step," she said. He was quiet for a moment, working it through. "We'd need to know when they're coming. Hob Finley watches the north road. He's been watching it since the barn. He'll send word if he sees a group moving after dark." She paused. "I already asked him." Gideon looked at her. "When?" "This afternoon, while you were getting the cattle back in." She met his eyes steadily. "I told you the thinking was already happening." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You did say that." "I need you to trust me on the trail," she said. "In the dark, on bad footing. I'm slower than you and I know it. You'll have to match my pace and not push it." "I'll match your pace," he said. "And I need you to trust the plan even when it feels wrong. When we're up there and they're below us, and every instinct says to move early, we have to wait for the right moment." "What's the right moment?" "When they've started setting charges but haven't finished," she said. "If we move too early, they scatter and regroup and try again another night. If we wait until the charges are set and we stop them from detonating, they have to retrieve the dynamite or leave it. Either way, they've failed and they know we were above them the whole time." She looked at him. "I want them to know we were above them." "Because it changes what Crow thinks he's dealing with," Gideon said. "Because it changes what everyone thinks," she said, "including his men." Hobbs' rider came 4 nights later. It was a boy of about 14, Hobbs' youngest, who arrived at the Mercer gate at 10 in the evening on a horse he'd ridden hard enough that the animal was damp through and blowing. Gideon was awake. He had been sleeping light for 4 days, which was not comfortable but was necessary, and he heard the hoofbeats on the road and was off the porch before the boy reached the gate. 8 men, the boy said, still breathing fast from the ride. "Left Crow's north property about an hour ago. Mr. Finley counted the horses. They're coming down the East Cut, not the main road." "East Cut comes out at the base of the ridge," Gideon said. Yes, sir. Mr. Finley says they had packs on 2 of the horses, heavy ones. Gideon thanked him and told him to water his horse and wait, and went to get Mara. She was already awake. She was dressed and had the sharps and a cartridge belt in her coat, and she was lacing her boots at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low. She looked up when he came in, and he could see in her face that same quality he'd seen on the ridge, that compression of everything unnecessary, the focusing down. "How many?" she said. 8, 2 horses loaded. They left Crows an hour ago. Then we have 40 minutes, maybe less. She stood and tested her weight on the leg the way she always did when she'd been sitting, checking the inventory, figuring out what she had to work with. "Wake Dale. Tell him to keep the crew in the bunkhouse regardless of what they hear. If men come to the main property, hold and don't engage." "He won't like that." "He doesn't have to like it." She picked up the sharps. "He has to do it." Gideon went to the bunkhouse, delivered the instructions to a Bleary, and then rapidly alert Dale Pruitt, and was back at the house in 4 minutes. They went out the back and east, moving across the dark pasture toward the base of the ridge, Mara setting the pace the way she'd said she would, and Gideon walking beside her, and the night was cold and still, and the ridge was a black shape against a sky that was dark blue rather than black because of the stars. "Talk me through the trail," Gideon said quietly. "Starts at the old fence corner, the one with the iron post. Goes north along the rock face for about 30 yards before it starts climbing. The surface is loose shale for the first section. You step on the outer edge of each stone, not the center, or it slides. After the first bend, it goes to solid rock and it's better." She paused to navigate a dip in the pasture ground. "There are 2 places where the trail narrows to maybe 18 inches. Don't look down at either of them." "How far down?" "Don't look," she said again, and he decided to take that as an answer. They found the iron fence post in the dark by touch, which Gideon did not enjoy but managed, and the trail was where Mara said it was, which he had believed but was still relieved to confirm. She led, and he followed, and she had not exaggerated about the shale. It was the kind of footing that required you to be right about where you put each foot, or you were immediately wrong in a way that had consequences. And in the dark, with only starlight to work from, being right required moving slowly and deliberately, and trusting that the mountain wasn't going to change its mind about what was where. Mara moved across it with a patience that he recognized as something built over time, over years of navigating ground that didn't accommodate her well and learning to work with it rather than against it. The leg gave her trouble on the steep sections. He could hear the effort in her breathing. But she didn't stop and she didn't ask for help, and he didn't offer it, because he understood by now that offering it was the wrong thing, that what she needed from him was presence, not assistance. They were on the solid rock section, above the first bend, when they heard the men below. Not voices. Sounds. The clink of equipment, the scuff of boots on the lower approach trail, the particular quiet of a group of men trying to be quieter than they were. 8 men with dynamite and a purpose couldn't move in complete silence, and the rock walls of the approach carried sound upward in a way they may not have anticipated. Mara stopped. Gideon stopped behind her. They stood without speaking for 30 seconds, listening. 12 minutes behind us, she said, barely a breath. They kept moving. The place she had in mind was a flat shelf of rock about 10 feet wide and 4 feet deep that sat directly above the main outcrop of the spring. Above it, and set back slightly, so that anyone approaching from below would have to be looking almost straight up and specifically for it to know it was there. The shelf had a clean sightline to the approach path for the last 40 yards, which was the distance at which men with dynamite would have to stop moving and start working. They reached it with perhaps 5 minutes to spare, which was not much but was enough. Mara went flat on the shelf and Gideon went down beside her, and they lay there in the cold dark and waited. And below them the sounds got closer and then resolved into shapes. 8 men moving up the approach in a loose line, 2 of them carrying the pack horses, the others spread around them. One man out front was carrying a lantern with the shutter mostly closed, giving just enough light to navigate the trail without advertising themselves across the valley. "Third man from the front," Gideon said, his voice so low it was almost nothing. "He's giving directions." Mara looked. The third man was stopping the group, pointing, saying something that didn't carry up. She watched the way the others oriented to him. "He knows the spring location," she said. He's been here before. The reconnaissance. Someone had walked this property in daylight recently and been thorough about it. They watched the group spread out around the main outcrop. Two men began removing equipment from the packs. Gideon could see the shape of the bundles, the coiled fuse, the careful way they handled the weight of the cases. The man giving directions spoke in low tones, and the others listened and then began to position themselves along the rock face, identifying the placement points. Gideon had his rifle up. "Not yet," Mara said. "I know." The work was methodical. These were not panicked men or amateurs. They moved with the efficiency of people who had done similar things before in other contexts, which was a thought Gideon found unpleasant but filed away for later. 3 men were at the rock face now. The others held positions around the perimeter, and that was the thing Gideon was tracking, the outer men, because those were the ones who might have angles on the shelf if anyone looked up. "When the fuse goes in," Mara said. "When the fuse goes in," he agreed. They watched. One of the men at the rock face turned back to the equipment carrier and received the first charge, handling it with the careful deliberateness that told you he respected it. He turned back to the rock. The fuse went in. Gideon fired. He put the shot between the man's feet and the charge, not at either, but at the ground between them. And the crack of the rifle off the rock walls of that narrow approach was enormous, amplified and bounced and multiplied until it sounded like more guns than one. The man with the charge threw himself back from pure reflex, and the charge went with him, tumbling, and the shout that came out of him was equal parts profanity and terror. Before the echo had finished, Mara fired. She put her shot into the equipment pack, not the dynamite, the cap case, the small metal box sitting open on the flat rock beside the pack horse. The box leapt sideways, and the caps inside scattered across the rock, small bright sounds in the aftermath of the gunshots, and without the caps, the charges were wait, not threat. The man giving directions said something sharp, and the outer men moved, raising weapons, looking, and finding nothing, because 40 feet above them on a shelf of dark rock lay 2 people who were not visible and whose muzzle flashes had bounced off every surface simultaneously and given no useful directional information to anyone trying to locate them. Gideon worked the lever and fired again, this time at the lantern, and the shutter took the bullet and the light went out and the approach was suddenly completely dark except for the starlight that reached the bottom of the narrow cut, which was not much. The man giving directions said something else, sharper, and there was a silence in which 8 men stood in the dark on a mountain trail with no light and no caps and no idea where the guns were. And then one of the pack horses pulled its lead, startled and done with the situation, and the sounds of men deciding that the horse had the right idea were rapid and unambiguous. They went back down the trail faster than they had come up. Gideon listened to them go, tracking the sounds, counting the time, making sure the retreat was real and not a repositioning. After 5 minutes, Mara said, "They're off the ridge." "How do you know?" "You can hear the approach from up here if you know what to listen for. The echo changes when they pass the lower bend." She was still flat on the shelf, not moving yet. "Give it another 10 minutes. They gave it another 10 minutes. Quote, when they came down off the ridge, it was past midnight and cold in the specific penetrating way of high-elevation nights. And Mara's leg was bad enough that on the shale section she put her hand against the rock face for balance twice, which she would not have done if anyone other than Gideon was watching. He said nothing about it. At the base of the trail she stopped and stood still for a moment, breathing, and he stood with her and waited. "They left the charges," she said. "I saw. We need to get them off the rock face before morning, before anyone comes up here who doesn't know what they're looking at." "I'll go up at first light," he said. "I've handled dynamite before." She looked at him. "Where?" "Survey crew, clearing rock for passage markers." He paused. "I'm not cavalier about it." "All right," she said. She pushed off the rock and they started back across the pasture. The ranch house lights were visible in the distance. Dale had kept a lamp burning on the porch. They were halfway across the pasture when Mara said, "They'll tell Crow what happened. They will. And Crow will know someone was above him, that the mountain was being watched. That's what you wanted." "Yes," she said, "but I also want you to understand that this makes him more dangerous in the short term, not less. A man like Crow, when he's been made to look like a fool in front of hired men, that's not a man who reconsiders. That's a man who doubles." You said that before, that he'd double down. I said angry men with money don't recalculate. I still believe it. They walked in silence for a moment. So what does he do next? Gideon asked. He can't go for the spring again, not after tonight. She was working it through as she spoke. He goes for something else, something that matters enough to force a decision. What matters enough? She was quiet for longer than usual. When she spoke, her voice was careful in a way that told him the thing she was about to say was something she'd been circling for a while. He needs information about the spring that he doesn't have. He knows the location now, but not the documentation details, not where the copies are, not what exactly Pike recorded, not whether there are legal mechanisms already in motion. She paused. Someone who had access to the household accounts and the correspondence would know those things. Gideon stopped walking. Mara kept going for 2 more steps and then stopped as well. And she didn't turn around immediately, and when she did, her face was composed in that careful way of someone who has had a thought they don't like and have had to make peace with it before they could say it out loud. Vivian's been unhappy for months, she said, and Crow has money. The words sat between them in the cold pasture air. You don't know that, Gideon said. No, Mara said. I don't know it. She looked at him steadily. I know that someone gave those men the specific location of the spring approach, that it's not a path anyone walks unless they've been shown it or told about it. And I know who in this household had access to everything Pike documented and everything I wrote to Denver. She stopped. I don't want it to be true. Wanting doesn't change it either way, he said. No, she said. It doesn't. They stood there in the dark pasture, the cold working through their coats, the ranch house lamp burning small and steady in the distance, and the valley around them quiet in the way it gets after something large has happened, and the land is simply continuing on, the way land does, indifferent to who wins and who loses and who gets to keep what they've built and who watches it taken apart. Mara turned back toward the house and kept walking, and Gideon went with her, and neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing to say that would make what was coming any different from what it was going to be. They didn't confront Vivian that night. Mara made that decision somewhere between the pasture and the porch, and Gideon saw her make it. Saw the moment she set the thing aside in the way you set aside a tool you're not ready to use yet. Not because you've decided against it, but because the timing is wrong, and using it wrong is worse than waiting. She went inside, hung her coat, and told Dale, who was awake and tense at the kitchen table, that the situation on the ridge was resolved and he could stand the crew down. Dale asked questions she answered with the minimum necessary information, and then she went to bed, and that was that. Gideon retrieved the dynamite at first light. He went up the goat trail alone in the gray pre-dawn, moving slowly on the shale because there was no one to keep pace with and no reason to rush, and he found the charges where the men had left them. 3 of them, set against the rock face in the placement positions, the fuse cut and ready, and the scattered caps lying across the rock like small silver seeds. He removed the charges with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who respects the material, wrapped them individually, and packed them down the mountain in a canvas bag that he kept away from his body and close to the outer edge of the trail. He buried them at the base of the north pasture fence, deep enough that the ground would take the memory of them, and told no one where. By the time he got back to the house, Mara was at the kitchen table with coffee and the accounts ledger open in front of her, not looking at it. She had the expression of someone who has slept badly on a decision and woken up with it still there, unchanged, waiting. She's still in her room, Mara said. You could be wrong, Gideon said. I could. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Tell me something that explains how Crow's men knew the exact spring approach, a path that isn't on any map, that my father didn't use, that I never told Dale or the cousins about. He couldn't tell her something that explained it because there wasn't anything. I need to talk to her, Mara said. Alone. All right. If I'm right, she stopped, started again. If I'm right, I don't know what I'll do. I want to be honest about that. I've thought about it, and I don't know. You don't have to know yet, he said. Yes, I do. Because if I go in there and I'm right and I don't have a decision made, I'll say something I can't take back or I'll say nothing at all. And neither one of those is right. Gideon sat down across from her. Outside the kitchen window, the morning was coming up slowly, clouds sitting low over the western mountains, the light flat and gray. "What does she need?" he said. "Not what does she deserve. What does she need?" Mara looked at him. "She needs a way out," she said after a moment. "She has always needed a way out of this place. She just chose a way that cost everyone else." "Then give her the way out," he said. "Not as a reward, just as the thing that ends it." Mara sat with that for a long time. Then she closed the ledger and stood up. The conversation between the sisters lasted 40 minutes. Gideon was on the porch for all of it, not listening. The walls were thick enough, and both women were not given to shouting, but present, because being on the other side of a door was different from being across the yard, and Mara had not asked him to leave entirely. When Vivian came out of the house, she had a bag. Not a full bag, not a carefully packed, this was planned bag, but the kind you assemble in 30 minutes when the decision has been made for you and your options have reduced to the single one that remains. She was wearing her good dress, which was not appropriate for travel, but was the dress she put on when she needed to feel like herself. And her face was composed in the way faces are when the crying is finished and what's left is just the aftermath of it. She stopped on the porch when she saw Gideon. He stood up. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he didn't have a clean word for. Not quite shame, not quite defiance, somewhere in the complicated territory between them. "I didn't think they'd burn the barn," she said. "I want you to know that." I told him about the spring, and I took the money he offered, and I told myself it was just information, that no one would get hurt. "People always tell themselves that," Gideon said. "I know." She looked away, at the valley, at the mountains. "I thought if the ranch sold, Mara would be free of it. That's what I told myself, that I was doing her a favor." She paused. "I know how that sounds." "It sounds like something people say when the true reason is harder to say," Gideon said. She didn't argue with that. She looked back at him. "She's giving me the stage fare to Denver. I don't deserve it." "No," he said. "You don't." She nodded once, the way you nod when someone confirms what you already knew. She went down the porch steps and across the yard toward the road, and she walked like a woman who was not going to look back. And she didn't. Mara came out onto the porch and stood beside Gideon, and they watched Vivian's figure diminish down the road toward town, the morning light still flat and gray around her. "She's going to be all right," Mara said. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't prediction. It was just what she needed to believe right now, and he wasn't going to argue with that need. "Probably," he said. "I gave her the money because my mother would have, not because Vivian earned it." She turned away from the road. "And because I need to be able to sleep at night, and I can't do that if I know she's stranded somewhere." "That's a human reason," he said. "It's a tired reason," she said, "but it's the one I've got." Silas Crow came to the ranch 3 days later, and he came himself, which surprised Gideon and didn't surprise Mara at all. He arrived in a good buggy with a single driver, dressed in the particular way of men who want to project authority in circumstances where their authority has recently been damaged, too carefully, the clothes doing work the man can't do on his own. He was in his 60s, broad through the chest, but running to heaviness now, with white hair and the red, weathered face of a man who had spent decades outdoors giving orders and not taking them. He had the eyes of a person who had been the most powerful man in a room for so long that he'd forgotten how to not have that. He pulled up to the gate, and Mara came off the porch to meet him. Gideon stayed on the porch, positioned at the rail where his presence was clear without being aggressive. Dale was in the barn with sightlines to the gate. The cousins were elsewhere on the property. Crow looked at Mara from the buggy. He looked at the scarred face and the body and the way she stood in her yard, and Gideon watched him perform a rapid, involuntary recalibration, the way men like Crow always did when the person in front of them refused to match the version they'd been carrying in their head. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Crow," she said. "You can step down or you can talk from up there. Either way." He stepped down. The driver stayed with the buggy. "I'll be direct," Crow said. "I'd appreciate it," she said. "I've made mistakes in my approach to acquiring this property," he said. "I'm prepared to acknowledge that and to make a clean offer. A fair price for the land and the water rights both. Enough for you to establish yourself somewhere more manageable. He said, more manageable, the way people say things when they've almost said something worse and caught themselves. No, Mara said. Crow blinked. He had come prepared for a negotiation. A no delivered in the first 30 seconds was not the architecture of the conversation he'd built. You haven't heard the number, he said. It doesn't matter what the number is, she said. This ranch isn't for sale. Miss Mercer, you're a practical woman. You've had significant difficulties in recent months. Infrastructure damage, security concerns, a family situation that I understand has recently changed. He said that last part carefully, but there was something under it, a reminder of leverage, a reminder that he knew about Vivian and that information was the last card he held. Mara's face didn't move. The infrastructure damage was arson committed by men you hired, she said. The security concerns were manufactured by the same. And the family situation is my own business and not something you get to factor into a negotiation. I'm not... You sent men to burn my barn, she said. You sent men to drive my cattle into a canyon. You sent men with dynamite to destroy a documented water source on my titled property. I have a surveyor's report, dated and witnessed. I have documentation of the water rights predating your interest in them by 15 years. And I have... She paused, and her voice didn't rise. It went flatter, which was somehow more a very good memory for what I've seen, what I know, and who is responsible for what. Crow looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at Gideon on the porch. Your man going to let you conduct your own business? He said. He's not my man, Mara said. He's my partner. And yes, because that's what partners do. Crow looked back at her. Something moved through his face that Gideon couldn't cleanly identify from the porch. Not quite anger and not quite respect, and maybe a small, grudging portion of both. You're making an enemy, he said. You were already my enemy, she said. You just hadn't said so this plainly before. I find I prefer the plain version. Crow stood there for another 5 seconds, and those seconds were the kind that have weight to them, where a man is deciding which version of himself he's going to walk back to his buggy as. Then he turned and climbed back up, and the driver took them out through the gate and down the road, and Mara stood at the fence and watched them until the buggy was around the bend and out of sight. She turned and came back to the porch and sat down in the chair hard, like her legs had been making a decision they'd only just informed her of. You're shaking, Gideon said. I know, she said. I've been shaking since he got out of the buggy. I just didn't let it show. He didn't say anything about it being impressive, because she would have found that condescending, and because it was more than impressive, it was the kind of thing that didn't have a good word. The specific courage of a person standing their ground when their ground has been on fire 3 times, and the man in front of them has more money and more men and fewer limits. It wasn't bravery the way stories describe bravery. It was quieter than that. It was just the refusal to be smaller than she was, sustained over years. And it didn't feel like a victory so much as a maintenance, and she would not have called it courage because she had needed to do it, and so she had done it. He got her a glass of water, and she drank it, and the shaking settled gradually, and she sat on the porch and looked at the valley for a while. He'll try something else, she said. Maybe, Gideon said, or maybe he decides the cost is higher than the return. What makes you think that? Because everything he's tried has failed, and he knows now that you know it was him. That documentation cuts both ways. If you take it to the territorial authorities, he has exposure. He leaned against the rail. Men like Crow don't get to be men like Crow by being stupid. He'll recalculate. She looked at him. You said scared men make mistakes, and men who recalculate sometimes walk away. I did say that. Which one is he? Gideon thought about the way Crow had looked at Mara in those final seconds at the fence. Both, I think, in different parts of himself. The letter from the territorial authority came 6 weeks later. It arrived on a Tuesday in a plain envelope with official markings, and Mara read it standing at the kitchen table and read it again sitting down. Then she folded it and put it in the tin box where she kept the survey documents and the copy of the water rights filing. Someone in Cheyenne filed a complaint against Crow, she told Gideon that evening. Fraud claims on 3 separate land acquisitions in 2 territories. They're looking for witnesses. Hob? Gideon said. Hob, she confirmed. And 2 other operations Crow pressured in the last 4 years. Hobbs been writing letters to anyone who'd read them for 8 months. He just needed enough names. You going to add yours? She had already thought about this. He could see that she had. Yes, she said. I'll document the barn fire, the cattle drive, the dynamite. Everything I can substantiate. She set her coffee down. It won't be fast. These things aren't fast. No, he said. And it might not result in anything definitive. Courts in this territory move slow, and Crow has attorneys. I know. But it puts it on record, she said. Officially. Which is different from just knowing. He nodded. She looked at him across the table with the lamp between them and the house quiet around them. I used to think keeping my head down was the safe choice, she said. Manage what I can manage. Don't make noise. Don't attract attention. My father's approach. It kept the ranch alive for a while. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. But keeping your head down just means someone else is deciding the shape of your life. And they're usually deciding it in their favor. This was true. And he knew it was true, not from this story, but from the texture of every year he'd spent trying to be unobtrusive about the things he wanted, trying to want them quietly enough that losing them wouldn't hurt, which was a strategy that didn't work, and that most people figured out eventually if they were lucky. You stopped keeping your head down, he said. I stopped having that option, she said, which maybe amounts to the same thing, or maybe doesn't. I'm not sure it matters which. It matters, he said. Because one of those is something that happened to you and the other is something you chose. She was quiet for a moment. Which do you think it was? I think, he said, that you had the capability for a long time. And the situation got bad enough that the capability and the willingness finally got to be in the same place at the same time. She considered this. That's a generous reading. It's the accurate one, he said. They rebuilt the barn in October, when the weather was still holding and the lumber cord Pruitt had offered finally arrived. It took 3 weeks with everyone working, including Mara, who could not do everything but could do more than most people expected and did it without ceremony. The new barn was larger than the old one by a third, which had not been the plan initially, but became the plan once they laid the foundation and saw what the space allowed. Dale and the cousins worked the build alongside 2 men from town who came out on weekends, and Hob Finley sent his oldest boy for a week, and there was something in the collective effort of it that Gideon recognized from other places and other times, the specific quality of people working together on something that will outlast the working, the way that kind of labor has a texture to it that other labor doesn't. Mara stood at the edge of the new structure one afternoon and looked at it going up, the raw timber bright in the fall light, and she had an expression that Gideon had not seen on her before, which was the expression of someone who is experiencing something they didn't know they were allowed to expect. My father built the first one himself, she said. Just him and 2 hired men in a summer. You know what you're building now, Gideon said. He was figuring it out as he went. So am I, she said. You're figuring it out better, he said. She made the almost laugh sound and went back to work. Chessie. The question between them had been present since before either of them named it, which is the way those questions usually work. They accumulate in the ordinary moments, in the shared mornings and the working silences and the evenings on the porch, where neither person is pretending to be somewhere they'd rather be. Gideon raised it one evening in November, when the barn was finished and the herd was in good condition for the coming winter, and the survey documentation was filed in Cheyenne, and the complaint against Crow was officially a matter of territorial record. He raised it because the urgency of the immediate problems was no longer providing cover for not raising it, and because he was 31 years old and had spent enough of his life managing his own wants quietly enough to not have to be accountable to them. They were at the East Ridge. They went there sometimes in the evenings, not always for a reason, just because the view was what it was, and the spring was their thing, the thing they had found and protected, and being there felt like being in a place where the stakes were clear. I'm not going anywhere, he said. She looked at him. I want to be clear about that, he said. Not because the work isn't done, the work's never done, but because I want to be here. This is the place I want to be. He paused. And you're the person I want to be building it with. She was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough that a less certain man might have filled it, but he had said what he meant and he was willing to let it sit. You know what this looks like to people, she said, not testing him, just making sure he'd thought it through. I know what it looks like to the people in Ash Hollow, he said. A man choosing the wrong sister. A man who must have something wrong with him. He met her eyes. I don't find that information interesting. I do, she said. I've been finding it interesting my whole life. It doesn't stop mattering just because you're not bothered by it. I know, he said. I'm not telling you it should stop mattering. I'm telling you it doesn't change what I'm saying. She looked at the valley below them, the last light going out of it slowly, the way it does in fall when the angle is shallow and the colors deepen before they're gone. I'm not easy to be around, she said. I hold things. I work things out slow and don't talk while I'm doing it. I've been managing this ranch and everything related to it by myself for long enough that I don't always know how to let someone else into the decision. I've noticed, he said. And I'll have bad days with the leg, she said. Days I can't do what I need to do, and it makes me... She stopped. Difficult. I've noticed that too, he said. And you're staying anyway. I'm staying anyway, he said. Not because I haven't noticed, because I have, and it doesn't change the arithmetic for me. She turned and looked at him with that straight-on look she had, the one that didn't give you any flattering angles to hide behind. I don't need rescuing, she said. Mara, you rescued 62 cattle and a burning barn and a spring and about a dozen other things since I've been here. He held her gaze. The thought that you need rescuing has not crossed my mind once. Something in her face settled, not softened. She didn't soften. That wasn't her, would never be her, and he didn't want it to be. But something that had been braced against a possibility relaxed because the possibility hadn't arrived. All right, she said. All right, he said. They stood there a while longer, the November cold coming off the mountain at their backs, and the valley below them doing what valleys do, the creek catching what remained of the light. We need a second water trough in the north pasture before hard freeze, she said. I ordered the materials last week, he said. She glanced at him. You did? You mentioned it in August. I wrote it down. She was quiet for a moment. I don't think anyone's ever written down what I said before. He didn't know what to say to that. Not because it wasn't something to say something about, but because some things are large enough that any response lands smaller than the thing itself. So he didn't say anything, and she didn't require him to, and they stood together on the ridge above the spring that was theirs, that had always been theirs, that they had fought for and documented and kept. The territorial case against Silas Crow moved the way Mara had predicted, slowly, over many months, with delays and continuances, and the particular friction of powerful men defending themselves in courts, built partly by people like them. But it moved. By the following spring, there were 7 complainants and a territorial inspector who had begun asking questions that Crow's attorneys were having trouble answering in ways that didn't create other questions. Crow made no further moves against the Mercer property. Whether this was pragmatism or the beginning of his focus being required elsewhere was difficult to say, and Mara didn't spend much time trying to say it. She had a ranch to run. The ranch they ran over the course of that first full year together was not the operation from the brochure, not the clean lines version of a frontier success story. The winter took 2 calves they hadn't been able to save, and a section of the new north fence blew in a February wind and let 4 steers onto Hob Finley's property for 3 days before anyone found them. The irrigation work Mara had planned for the spring creek took twice as long as estimated because the ground below the frost line was different from what it had looked like, and they had 2 solid weeks in March where they barely spoke to each other because Gideon had made a purchasing decision without consulting her, and she had not handled discovering this quietly. That last one sat between them for a week before she said what was actually wrong, which was not that he had bought the materials without asking, but that buying materials without asking was what her father had done to her mother for 30 years. And she knew that Gideon was not her father, and that the circumstances were different, and that knowing a thing is different from feeling it when it hits you. He listened to all of it. He said he understood. He said he would ask. He meant it, and he kept to it, which she watched for and noticed without saying she was watching. This is the thing about building something real with another person. It is not the dramatic moments that tell you whether it will hold. Those moments come and you survive them or you don't, but they are not the measure. The measure is the ordinary accumulation of days. Whether the person you've chosen shows up in the plain Tuesday version of themselves with the same decency they showed up with when things were acute. Whether they learn from the specific ways they've been wrong. Whether they are still interested in you, not the story of you, not the crisis version of you, but the Tuesday version, the limping across the yard to check the fence version, the sitting at the table in silence with the ledger version. Gideon showed up to those days. So did Mara. The people of Ash Hollow adjusted, the way people in small places adjust to things they initially found strange, gradually, without announcement, through a shift in the small daily interactions that adds up, over time, to a different understanding. Dale Pruitt, who had spent years working around the woman in the house, became one of the most reliable advocates in the county for consulting Mara Mercer before making any decision related to water management or grazing rotation in the valley, because he had seen what happened when you did and what happened when you didn't. Cord Pruitt at the livery began sending people with livestock questions to the Mercer Ranch, rather than to the old ranching families who had the reputation but not, as it turned out, the specific knowledge. Hob Finley, whose water access was directly tied to the health of the Mercer Spring, became a reliable ally in the way that shared practical interests create reliable allies. None of this happened because the world became generous. It happened because Mara had always been right about the land, and now there was no longer a structure in place to keep that fact invisible. On a morning in late spring of the following year, Mara walked the East Ridge alone. She did it for no particular reason, or rather, for the kind of reason that doesn't require articulation, which is that some places become yours in the way that certain hours become yours, not because you claim them formally, but because you've been present in them enough times that they carry your shape. She moved up the trail slowly, the leg taking the slope at the pace it was willing to take it. And she didn't push it, because she had learned, finally and imperfectly, that there was a difference between accommodating a limitation and being defeated by one. She reached the outcrop and put her hand against the rock and felt the cold of the water behind it, the spring moving the way it always moved, the way it had moved before her and would move after her, indifferent to the human business conducted in its vicinity, and reliable in the way that things are reliable when they are simply doing what their nature requires. She thought about her mother, who had been practical and quiet and underestimated in the same way, who had given her the rifle and the knowledge of how to use it without ever saying this will matter, because some people teach the things that matter without naming them as such. She thought about her father, who had been a good man in many ways and an insufficient one in others, as most people are, and who had spent 30 years teaching her sister the accounts and Mara the land without quite understanding what he was doing, and who would have been genuinely confused and probably proud of how things had turned out, if he could have seen it. She thought about Vivian, which she still did sometimes, with the complicated mixture of feelings that doesn't resolve clean and probably shouldn't. She'd had one letter from Denver, brief and careful, no return address, that said she had found work and was managing. Mara had read it 3 times and put it in the tin box with the survey documents. She thought about Gideon, who was below her somewhere doing one of the 100 ordinary things that keeping a ranch alive requires, who had chosen this place and this work and this woman with the specific intentionality of a person who is done making the easier choice and who showed up to that choice every day in the plain, imperfect way that means more than any single dramatic moment. The valley was green with late spring, the best it looked all year. The creek visible as a silver line through the lower pasture. The mountains blue and permanent behind it. It was not a perfect place. It was hard ground and hard winters and work that did not end and neighbors who could be enemies and weather that did not ask permission before it took what it took. She looked at it and she thought, this is mine. Not in the self-congratulatory way, not in the I have conquered something way, but in the plain, grounded way of a person who has put their hands in the same soil for long enough that the relationship runs in both directions, that the land knows her the way she knows it, that there is a record of her here that doesn't require documentation because it is held in the ground itself, in the repaired fence lines, and the corrected irrigation and the spring that flows because she found it and understood it and refused, when the time came, to let someone else take it. She was 34 years old. She had a scar on her face and a limp that would worsen in cold weather for the rest of her life. She had a barn that was better than the one that burned. She had a partner who wrote things down. She was not the story that Ash Hollow had told about her for 20 years. The story of the girl nobody wanted, the sister you felt sorry for, the body that didn't fit the frontier's narrow idea of what a woman was for. That story had never been accurate. It was just the story that people tell when they see the surface of a thing and don't look any further, when they measure a person against the idea of a person, rather than against what that person is actually doing and actually building and actually capable of surviving. The real story was the spring. The real story was that the water had been there the whole time, deeper than anyone thought to look, feeding the valley whether the valley knew it or not. And the woman who knew where it was had been there the whole time too, carrying that knowledge quietly through every year that she was invisible to everyone around her, waiting, not passively, not patiently, but in the live and working way of someone who has not given up, but has not yet found the right conditions. The conditions had arrived, imperfect and hard, and better than she'd had any right to expect. She turned and went back down the ridge, taking each step deliberately on the familiar rock, heading toward the work and the day, and the ordinary life that was hers.